Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive, into Genesis chapter 11.
Okay.
Um, it's funny because, everyone thinks of the Tower of Babel story,
Right.
and then they're like, well, that's it.
Yeah.
I know that one.
Yeah.
But we are going deep
Uh-huh.
into some online study notes by My Christian Space,
Okay.
and I'm telling you, there are layers to this chapter
Yeah.
that, you miss on the first read, second read, third read.
You do.
You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Genesis 11, I think, is one of those chapters that people kind of just breeze over because they think they know the gist of it, you know?
The Tower of Babel, okay, got it, next.
Yeah, exactly. But when you really start digging into the nuances in the language and, like you said, the layers of meaning, it's really profound. It really speaks to, I think, some of the core issues of the human condition.
Yeah, and the study notes that we're looking at, they really nail this with the title that they give it. They call it The Big Detour.
Oh, interesting.
And I was like, ooh, detour from what? What's the road that we're supposed to be on in Genesis?
That is the question, isn't it? And it's a question that takes us back to the very beginning. I mean, if we go back to Genesis 1, right? God lays out this beautiful plan for humanity. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, essentially partner with him in creation. But then you get to chapter 11, and we see this shift, this veering off course. Instead of spreading out and filling the earth as God instructed, humanity huddles together. They become obsessed with building this city and this tower that's supposed to reach heaven. It's almost like a symbol of human striving and ambition, even pride, as if they could reach God's level on their own terms.
We got this. We'll make our own way, God. Thanks for the thought, though.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It's this innate human desire for autonomy, right? To make our own rules, be masters of our own destiny. And it's a theme that echoes, throughout Scripture.
Yeah.
From Adam and Eve's choice in the Garden of Eden to countless other instances where humanity chooses its own will over God's.
And just like in Eden, there are some pretty significant consequences to this detour.
Yes, absolutely. But it's important, I think, to understand that God's response, it's not about punishment, right? It's not that God felt threatened by this tower like it was some kind of competition. The study notes, they really emphasize that God is concerned with the state of the human heart. The tower itself was simply a symptom of a much deeper issue, this prideful desire to usurp God's authority, to become like God rather than aligning with his will.
Yeah. So it's about more than just bricks and mortar, right? It's about what that tower represents.
Yes.
It's about the posture of the human heart.
Precisely. And that brings us to this really fascinating detail that the study notes actually highlight about the tower. It's the choice of building materials.
Okay.
They point out that the people used brick instead of stone for this grand tower, and it's more than just a trivial detail.
Okay, so I gotta admit, at first when I read that, I thought, really? Building materials? How deep can we go with this? But the study notes actually make a really interesting point about it.
They do, because brick, being man-made, it represents human effort and ingenuity. It's about taking the resources God has provided, right? But then molding them to our own will, our own designs. Stone, on the other hand, especially in the ancient world, was seen as a symbol of God's creation, something raw and elemental, untouched by human hands.
So by choosing brick over stone, it's like they were making a very deliberate statement, like, we're relying on our own efforts over God's provision.
Yeah. And this whole idea of choosing human effort over dependence on God, that's not just confined to Genesis 11. I mean, this becomes a recurring theme throughout the Bible. And it often leads to, let's just say, unintended consequences. And it makes you wonder, are we still trying to build our own towers today?
Woof. That's a question.
Right.
But before we go too far down that road, there's another detail about this whole Tower of Babel story that always gets me, and it's the directions, east versus west. I'd never really thought about directions having spiritual significance until I read these study notes.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, we often think of directions as purely geographical, but in the Bible especially, they're often imbued with all this deeper meaning. And the study notes point out that east, particularly in Genesis, is associated with God's presence, with holiness. Think about the Garden of Eden. It was planted in the east, right? West, on the other hand, often represents a moving away from God, a separation from his presence.
So when the text says that they migrated from the east, it's not just like a geographical detail. It's symbolic of them moving away from God's presence.
Exactly. It adds another layer to this idea of humanity's detour, right? They're not just geographically distancing themselves from the place where God established his presence, but they're also choosing to distance themselves spiritually. It's like they're turning their backs on the very source of life and blessing. And it makes you wonder, What if they had kept heading east? Would things have turned out differently?
It's an interesting question, and it kind of gets at the heart of one of the biggest theological debates of all time, which is this whole idea of free will versus God's sovereignty. If God wanted humanity to keep heading east, why give them the choice to go west in the first place?
Right.
And the study notes spend some time wrestling with this question, and it's one that I think continues to intrigue us today.
It really is one of those enduring mysteries, right? Like, how do we reconcile God's desire for a relationship with humanity with our own capacity to make choices that lead us away from him? And I appreciate that the study notes don't pretend to have all the answers to that.
Right.
But they do offer some really, I think, thought-provoking insights.
Yeah, and one of the points that they make, and I thought this was really helpful, is that just because God gives us free will, that doesn't mean he's just sitting back passively. Like, watching the human drama unfold and hoping for the best,
That's right. God isn't this distant deity who set the world in motion and then stepped back to just kind of observe the chaos. He's deeply invested in our well-being, even when we make choices that break his heart. And this brings us back to the Tower of Babel incident,
Yeah.
Because it's easy to see God intervening, confusing their language as this punishment. But what if it was actually an act of mercy?
Oh, that's interesting. I will fully admit, I never really thought about it from that angle before.
Yeah, it's a challenging concept for sure. But if we go back to that idea that God is less concerned with the tower itself, right?
Right.
And more concerned with the state of the human heart, then his actions start to make a lot more sense. Because what if, by confusing their language and scattering the people, God was actually preventing them from perpetuating this cycle of pride, ambition, self-reliance that would ultimately lead to more suffering?
So it's less about, punishing the disobedience and more about redirecting them from this path that was ultimately destructive.
Exactly. And it highlights this beautiful truth about God, right? He doesn't give up on us even when we mess up.
Right.
He loves us too much to let us continue down a path that will ultimately lead to pain and brokenness.
Like that C.S. Lewis quote, he's like, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And maybe the Tower of Babel was God's megaphone.
I love that analogy. And speaking of God working through human history, the chapter doesn't end with the Tower of Babel. In fact, that's just the first half, right?
Yeah.
The rest of the chapter is dedicated to all these extensive genealogies. And I'll be honest, I used to just kind of skim over those. I'd be like, names upon names. What's the point?
Right.
But the study notes, they really opened my eyes to the significance of these genealogies.
Yeah, it's so true. It's like you hit this speed bump after all the drama of the Tower of Babel. You're like, whoa, what's going on? But you realize these names, they're not just filler. They're actually crucial to understanding the broader narrative of Scripture, especially when you consider how important lineage and family lines were in the ancient world.
Oh, absolutely. These genealogies, they weren't just about keeping track of who begat whom, right?
Yeah.
They served as this powerful reminder that God works through human history, often in very specific and intentional ways. And what I love is that the study notes, they really dig into the meaning of some of these names, and that's where it gets really fascinating. For example, Peleg, his name, it's actually connected to the Hebrew word for division. And guess what happened during his lifetime?
The division of the people at Babel.
Exactly. It's like his very name foreshadows that pivotal moment in human history.
Wow.
And it reminds us that God is always at work, even in the midst of all this chaos and upheaval. And then there's Serug. His name means branch.
A branch. Okay, what's the significance of that?
Well, the study notes point out that it's actually through Serug's line that Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, eventually comes. So his name is pointing towards the future, towards God's plan to bless all nations through Abraham's descendants.
Wow. I've never caught that before. That's amazing. So these names are like these little clues.
Yes.
Hidden in plain sight.
Hidden in plain.
That point to God's larger plan for humanity.
Yes.
That's so cool.
It is. And it makes you want to go back and pay attention to all those names we might have glossed over in the past.
Right.
Who knows what other insights and connections we might find.
That's why I love these deep dives, man.
Yeah.
Always something new to discover, even in the most familiar passages. And speaking of discoveries, the study notes highlight another interesting character in these genealogies, and that's Terah, Abraham's father. And we know from Genesis 12 that God called Abraham to leave his home in Haran and travel to the land of Canaan. But what's fascinating is that it was actually Terah who initiated that journey.
That's right. According to Genesis 11.31, it was Terah who decided to leave Ur of the Chaldeans and head towards Canaan. But here's where it gets really interesting. He doesn't quite make it.
And this is where I start to think, okay, there's got to be a deeper meaning here. Like, why even introduce this whole journey if it gets cut short? And the study notes suggest that Terah's story might be another example of this big detour theme that we see throughout Genesis 11.
And that's where the study notes get really insightful, because they point out that, yes, while Terah set out with good intentions, he ultimately stopped short of fully obeying God's call. So instead of continuing on to Canaan, he settles in a place called Haran. And that's where he ends his days.
It's like he started out heading east, right, towards God's presence, but then he got sidetracked along the way.
Exactly. And I think there's a powerful lesson for us in that. It's not enough to just start heading in the right direction.
Yeah.
We have to be willing to fully surrender to God's plan, even when it's challenging, even when it means leaving behind our comfort zones.
It makes you wonder, like, what was going on with Terah?
Right.
What made him stop?
Yeah.
Was it fear? Was he just like, I don't know, this is scary? Was it that he wanted something that was more familiar? Or did he want to hold on to, like, his own control instead of just fully surrendering to God's plan?
Right, because those are all possibilities. And I think it reminds us, that faith journeys aren't always linear,
Right.
There are twists and turns, there are moments of doubt, there are moments of uncertainty. And I appreciate that the study notes don't shy away from this complexity. They actually highlight it. They suggest that Terah's story serves as a cautionary tale, right?
Yeah.
Even partial obedience, even good intentions can still have consequences.
It's not enough to just, like, start heading in the right direction. We have to, like, really embrace it, even when it's hard, even when it means letting go of what we thought was going to happen.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think that's one of the central messages of Genesis 11 as a whole. From the Tower of Babel to Terah's unfinished journey, it all points to this fundamental truth. True fulfillment, true blessing, comes when we align our hearts with God's will.
Yeah.
Even when it doesn't make sense to us.
Especially when it doesn't make sense to us.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's easy for us to, think we know better.
It makes me think about, like, all the times where I'm, like, trying to build my own tower.
Yeah.
Like, where I'm striving for things, success or security or significance based on, like, my own, like, what I can do instead of surrendering to, like, God, like, what is your plan?
That's such an important insight. And it's so easy, I think, in our culture especially, to get caught up in building our own kingdoms, right?
Yeah.
Focused on our own ambitions. And we lose sight of the bigger picture. But what Genesis 11 reminds us, is that true fulfillment, it's not found in our own achievements, but in aligning our hearts with the one who created us for a purpose.
It's humbling, right?
It is.
To realize, like, man, my plan, like, my best intentions can sometimes lead me totally astray.
Mm-hmm.
But also, like, the hope of it is that, like, God can redirect.
Absolutely.
We're not like, we don't just go off the rails and he's like, see ya.
That's right. That's the beauty of grace, right?
Yeah.
That even when we mess up, even when we stray, God is always there to gently, nudge us back in the right direction. And that's what makes Genesis 11, I think, such a timely and relevant chapter, even thousands of years later. It speaks to that universal human struggle to surrender to something bigger than ourselves, to trust in a plan that we can't always see or understand.
It's been so fascinating to, like, go through Genesis 11 with you. I hope that our listeners got something out of this. I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
It's just scratched the surface, absolutely.
Of this chapter, and that's what's so cool about it. I guess as we're wrapping up, is there one question that you hope that listeners will maybe take away from our conversation today?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the one question I would leave our listeners with is this: where are you trying to build your own tower?
Ooh.
In what areas of your life are you relying on your own efforts, your own striving, rather than surrendering to godly guidance? And perhaps even more importantly, are you willing to let go of those towers, to embrace the unknown, and to trust that God's plan, even if it's different from your own, is ultimately for your good?
That's a great question. And that's one, take that with you today, folks, as you're going throughout your day. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Genesis 11. We'll see you next time as we explore another fascinating part of the Bible.